more sensible policy would be to give Ukraine this money, give it to the government, which the government can then use to purchase Ukrainian-made systems from Ukrainian defense manufacturers. The report suggests that the Ukrainian defense industry, which before the war in the days of the Soviet Union was massive, they built all of the old Russian nuclear rockets in those days. They built aircraft engines, helicopters, transport aircraft. So they do have a sophisticated defense industry. But at the moment, it's only working to about a quarter of its capacity. Now, they've demonstrated with their drones in particular that they have a great capacity to blow up Russian ammunition dumps, Russian airfields, fuel depots. I mean, there have been some enormous explosions in ammunition depots over the last couple of weeks. So their intelligence in knowing where these places are, the production facilities, is very good. And they, of course, are willing to take the risk themselves to use these long-range systems. So that's probably the only way, ultimately, that we're going to resolve this particular dilemma.
This is The World in 10 from The Times. My guest today is Dr. Jamie Shea, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary General at NATO. Jamie, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Ukraine trying to sustain defence spending at a time when it's lost those really productive places, those places where aluminum is produced, and in the Donbass and Donetsk. How conceivable is it that Europe could shoulder that burden? We've seen Germany increasing its funding of Ukraine's defence needs, but could Europe pay for it if the US just says, no more cash?
Well, indeed, I think that probably the most cost-effective thing that the Europeans can do at the moment is, instead of buying very expensive weapons at home, which also take a long time to produce, or paying, over-the-counter costs in a very competitive market. Israel is fighting, other countries are at war, so 155mm shells are in high demand. The costs are very high. So Europe is paying top dollar to get these things on international markets. So maybe a more sensible policy would be to give Ukraine this money, give it to the government, which the government can then use to purchase Ukrainian-made systems from Ukrainian defense manufacturers. The report suggests that the Ukrainian defense industry, which before the war in the days of the Soviet Union was massive, they built all of the old Russian nuclear rockets in those days. They built aircraft engines, helicopters, transport aircraft. So they do have a sophisticated defense industry. But at the moment, it's only working to about a quarter of its capacity because the Ukrainian government doesn't have the money to give orders to the companies. They can't produce for nothing, of course. And so if the Europeans, and to some degree the United States, start, helping to develop that defence industry through technology transfer. For example, British Aerospace, Rheinmetall, some European countries have agreed to joint ventures, co-production in Ukraine. It's easier to maintain the weapons damaged in Ukraine rather than bring them all the way back to Germany to be repaired and send them all the way back. So if we can put more of the production there, of course, the factories will have to be underground because Russia will be trying to bombard them. I'm not arguing it's going to be easy, but the Ukrainians can now produce their own long-range drones. They've flown them all the way to Tomsk in Siberia, 2,500 kilometers. They've just unveiled their first long-range ballistic missile. They are good at technology. They're very good at innovation, as we know. So the answer, I think, in the long run, which will get around some of these political problems and these supply bottlenecks, is, as you say, to see about transferring more raw materials, more production capability, more technology transfer, more capital to allow Ukraine to build its own weapons and to use them. In the meantime, yes, though, there is a funding crisis, and you may have noticed that President Zelensky has just announced that he's increasing the war tax, a kind of Ukrainian VAT, from 1.5% to 5% to try to generate more funds at home. Obviously, this is not good news for the average Ukrainian consumer, but it shows the kind of squeeze that they're in at the moment.
Often when we talk about long-range weapons, as you mentioned there, we think about those red lines, so-called, and whether Russia's President Putin could react to those being crossed. Will a Harris or a Trump presidency change the calculus around this, both in how Ukraine might act and how the West would support it?
Well, it's a good question, and we don't know. Nobody knows, to be frank, because there is clearly a big debate going on within the US administration, and it's been going on for several months already, between, on the one hand, the State Department. I'm obviously simplifying a little bit, but nonetheless, the State Department, which is in favor of allowing Ukraine to use the US ATACMS and JASOMS long-range systems, authorised the UK to use the Storm Shadow missiles too, arguing that Putin is always huffing and puffing and trying to intimidate us with all of these nuclear threats. But every time we've crossed the red line with tanks, you remember, with long-range artillery, with F-16s, Putin has done nothing and backed down. But there are serious people in the Pentagon and in the National Security Council who argue that no, we can't assume that Putin's red lines will always turn out to be pink lines or no lines at all, and he won't react. There may come a point where a nuclear superpower says enough is enough is enough. We know that Putin has an appetite for taking risk, and we could get dragged into a conflict. And frankly, the Biden administration has not been able to resolve that issue in 6 months. So I'm not quite certain, Stuart, that it's going to resolve the issue going forward. That paralysis may last for a long, long time because the arguments are so finely balanced. Therefore, that's why I come back to my answer to your previous question, that from the Ukrainian point of view, the only way around this is to do the job themselves. Now, they've demonstrated with their drones in particular that they have a great capacity to blow up Russian ammunition dumps, Russian airfields, fuel depots. I mean, there have been some enormous explosions in ammunition depots over the last couple of weeks. So their intelligence in knowing where these places are, the production facilities, is very good. And they, of course, are willing to take the risk themselves to use these long-range systems. So that's probably the only way, ultimately, that we're going to resolve this particular dilemma.
The US election is looming, some calling it the most consequential in decades. We've seen President Zelensky of Ukraine meeting both candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, in the last few weeks. Just how important is the result of the US election to Ukraine?
Well, the United States so far has been supplying about 50% of all of the aid to Ukraine, not as much as Trump often claims. He sometimes tries to give his people the impression that the US is doing it all by itself, which of course is not true. The UK, France, Germany, Italy, a country that's in Europe that President Zelensky is visiting yesterday, have been doing quite a bit as well. And the EU, in fact, globally supplies more aid to Ukraine when it comes to financial support, humanitarian assistance, reconstruction aid, and all of that. But when it comes to weapons, yes, the US contribution is absolutely fundamental, both in terms of missiles, ammunition, air defense, and all of that. And if Trump cut that severely, then of course the Ukrainians would be in trouble. The problem for Zelensky is that Ukraine is already in trouble, frankly, with the Russians advancing in the Donetsk area, capturing more villages and towns. The Ukrainian army is under-equipped and under-resourced at the moment, and therefore Ukraine is even more dependent upon those US and European supplies at the moment than it was at the beginning of the conflict, when it could still rely upon the stocks that it had built up. Now, Zelensky knows very well that the answer is to ramp up more domestic production of weapons in Ukraine, and Ukraine has got a good defense industry. It produces, for example, over 1 million drones a year. But of course, it's going to take time to switch from reliance upon US supplies to domestic production. So it would be a big blow. On the other hand, final comment is that, as you know, recently Congress did finally vote this package of $61 billion of military assistance for Kiev. On his last visit to the United States, Zelensky got a further $8 billion of that. So providing Trump doesn't cut what has been previously agreed, it will keep Ukraine going for a few months into an eventual Trump administration, if that's what happens, before Zelensky would be looking to Trump and Congress to approve another big package like the previous $61 billion.
We saw Zelensky's charm offensive in Washington and New York a couple of weeks ago. What else do you think is going on, perhaps behind the scenes, beyond that domestic weapons increase, producing more weapons domestically, as the Ukrainians ready themselves for either outcome?
Well, I think, first of all, here in Brussels, at the heart of the EU, there is obviously a kind of contingency plan as a Trump presidency, if not probable yet, at least is beyond the possible, to obviously try to shift more of the burden onto the shoulders of the Europeans. I mean, people are mindful, for example, that even under a Harris administration, there might not be quite the same level of support for Ukraine as there was under Biden. Obviously, Harris has less of a track record in terms of NATO and European security. The other thing is Congress, that even under a Biden administration, as we were just discussing, Congress dragged its feet for 6 months in approving the new aid package. Even if, for example, Harris won, you could have the Republicans winning the Senate, the Republicans keeping control of the House. So it would be difficult even for a Democrat president to push through large amounts of aid. The US scene is, of course, very uncertain. It's not just the White House. We have to look at Congress as well. So here in Brussels, there is a sense that, yes, the Europeans have got to do more. Many European countries, look, let's take the Czech Republic as an example, have been forming consortia to try to sort of pool money to bulk buy 155mm ammunition. 500,000 rounds have been procured this year. That's working. You know, you've got consortia in Europe of the Dutch, the Danes, the Norwegians, the Belgians providing the F-16 jets. American jets, but provided by Europeans doing the training. And you've got the EU pooling 8+ billion euros on a so-called European peace facility, which is also arming Ukraine and, again, taking care of a lot of the training. So I'm not pretending for 1 minute that we Europeans will be able to completely take over from the American assistance, but at least there is a sense that, you know, whatever the scenario, the US is likely to be doing less in future. And if it's a really fundamental security interest for Europe as well as the United States that Ukraine remains a free state, then obviously more of the burden progressively is going to fall on this side of the Atlantic.
Beyond Europe and the US, there was some talk back when we saw the Kursk offensive begin, that this was maybe grabbing territory for use in any negotiation later, where you may be swapping territory if you were pushed into that. What's your sense as to the discussions going on around this in Kyiv?
Well, I think in Kiev, particularly in Ukrainian military circles, there's a lot of doubt about the wisdom of the Kursk offensive, opening that salient. At the time, of course, it was a morale booster for the Ukrainians. They wanted to show the West, particularly the US, ahead of Zelensky's visit to Washington and the UN, that they were able to take the fight to the Russians. They were still able to innovate. They could do daring things and put the Russians on the defensive. So from that point of view, it worked. But of course, the problems were also pretty evident from the beginning, which is that it would take Ukraine a large number of soldiers and weaponry, tanks, armored vehicles, anti-missile systems to hold the Kursk salient. And of course, if the Russians continue to advance, as they have done in Donetsk, particularly towards important junctions like for example, Volodar, which they've captured, Toretsk, which they are now occupying, then Ukraine would severely miss those troops being far away in Russia when they really needed them for defense, particularly as Zelensky, for that incursion into Russia, used some of his best troops. That's the first thing. The second thing is Russia is a vast country. In 1812, unlike Hitler, Napoleon got all of the way to Moscow, burned the city down, but still lost. So it's very difficult to sort of harm Russia by grabbing a part of its territory, particularly if what you grab is less than 1/3 of 1% of such an enormous country. So the Russians, in many ways, can absorb this kind of thing, wait until they can take it back, and not be affected in terms of what they're doing elsewhere. I think it would be good for Zelensky to have this territory as a bargaining chip when eventually negotiations begin, and he can cash that in for a larger Russian withdrawal from obviously the Donbass and the Donetsk. But the problem is that it's not much use occupying that territory until you get to the peace negotiation. And in the meantime, the cost of holding it, as I've said, in terms of the opportunity costs for what Russia is able to do in advancing against Ukraine, those costs are very, very high and difficult for Ukraine to sustain.
These red lines, these pink lines, Ukraine's victory plan, as we often call it, this will all have come up when President Zelensky met with Mark Rutte, the new NATO Secretary General, in London on Thursday. How do you think NATO, as an alliance, will be preparing for a new US president?
Well, NATO lived through Trump before. I was still at NATO in my last position there when Trump was president, and yes, it was a rocky time. Let's not pretend otherwise. Trump clearly wasn't as engaged in multilateral diplomacy or in NATO. He didn't have the same background as many other US presidents. He came to NATO meetings and never looked particularly comfortable, and he did, of course, but always bang the table about Europeans not spending enough money. But in that respect, he was right, because many Europeans, frankly, were not spending the 2% of GDP on defence. The UK was, so it was in a good position, but it was in a very small minority. But today, things look a lot better. As I mentioned, the Europeans are stepping up. You read the papers every day about, more big contracts to the defence companies, ramping up war production and stocks, buying new equipment, NATO exercises taking place all over Europe, NATO countries deploying forces to Central Europe. It's a very different story, and 23 of those NATO allies, admittedly not all of the 32, but 23, are now meeting that 2% target. I mentioned that Europe is now doing its bit for Ukraine. Europe is supplying weapons to Israel as well, not just the UK, but France, Germany, many others. And that's a cause that the United States definitely supports. The Europeans have been showing up in the Indo-Pacific, including the UK, sending its aircraft carrier there. So if I were the NATO Secretary General today going to Washington, I would feel that, I've got a better deck of cards, Stuart, quite frankly, a better set of arguments to present to Trump, saying, yeah, Mr. President, you were right, because Trump likes to be flattered. We've heeded what you said. We've taken you seriously. We're stepping up to the plate. We're being good allies. And there was some evidence, Stuart, from my last period at NATO that kind of argument does get through to Trump. But of course, we don't know. I mean, what helped us last time round was the fact that there were many Republicans in Congress who were pro-NATO, internationalist, didn't want to tear up NATO. Will they still be there after the elections? I mean, if we have a Congress of, frankly, Marjorie Taylor Greene types, then it's not going to be very easy. That's true. So we have to wait and see how that works out. Secondly, Trump appointed, national security advisors, secretaries of defense, secretaries of state, who were much more middle of the road internationalists than he was. Will he do the same again? What would be the shape of the administration? So I wouldn't sort of tear my hair out in complete horror in advance. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, Trump certainly doesn't want to be the US president who gave up the US superpower status, who ruined all of America's alliances, who left the door open for Russia and China. And I think what might help NATO this time round, Stuart, if I may be offered just a last comment answering this question, is that Russia and China are coming closer together. Iran, Russia and China are coming closer together. So Trump may have wanted perhaps in the past to, give Putin a hearing, very controversial. But as he sees that, Russia is more now in the Chinese camp, more in the Iranian camp, he may sort of sense that, yes, he can't sort of, pick and choose among America's adversaries, who he deals with and who he doesn't, in the same easy ways that he did before. And America is now up against not just one adversary, but a whole series who are working together. And he really does need allies in order to be able to see America's way through that. So, there are rational arguments. We just have to hope that Trump is prepared to listen. But obviously, there's going to be a lot of diplomacy coming out of Europe to at least try to get those arguments across.
You mentioned 23 countries now spending enough, hitting that 2% of GDP. Mr. Rutte, one of the first things he said is that needs to go up. 2% isn't enough, even though he's from the Netherlands, a country that we often think of as being a more frugal kind of international partner. Is this just accepting that even a Harris presidency will demand an increase in defense spending, and that defending NATO is getting more expensive?
Yes, I think is the simple answer. I mean, I give long answers. I could probably get away with a very short one there, which you'd be grateful for, of course, and say yes. No, absolutely, because clearly, the lesson of the last few years is that the more you give to Ukraine, the more you leave yourself vulnerable. Your own stocks are pretty empty. That's the case with the UK Army now, in many respects as well. Those SAF-16s, those artillery tubes, those Patriot air defence batteries have to be replaced. So you have to spend twice, if you like, once for Ukraine and once for yourself. And of course, defence equipment is always well ahead of inflation when it comes to price increases and all of the rest. I think one of the challenges for Mark Rutte is not just making the case for more defence spending, but coming up with plans to sort of show that NATO can produce the stuff at cost, on target, on time, none of these 10-year overruns at 4 times the price that we're so used to with defence equipment, and keep the trust of the voters that this extra money is at least being spent efficiently. But it's not going to be easy because, yes, you still got, 9 allies who have not met this 2% target. And in the case of Canada or some other countries, it's going to take them a few years yet to get there. Whereas you've got in Eastern Europe, countries like Poland racing ahead above 4%. Or the Baltic states at 2.5%. So I think you're still, whether you like it or not, Stuart, going to get a bit of a dichotomy between the countries in Central and Eastern Europe who feel the Russian threat very directly and who will have the political consensus to spend a large amount, and Western Europe, where I think perhaps threat perceptions will be less strong. Maybe not so much the UK, but continental Europe, and making that case, particularly at a time of economic difficulty, is going to be much harder. And keeping to 2% will be probably as much as we can expect from them, like Germany, for instance, under a lot of budgetary pressure, rather than to go to 3 or 4. If NATO does manage to go to something like 3, I think many allies will make it an aspirational target rather than a legally binding target. Yes, we recognise that we have to go in this direction. We'll do our level best, but don't, sort of hold us to it if, other circumstances come in instead. But I think the urgent task is getting the 9 that are still behind 2%, but have promised to get there, to keep their promises to get there in a reasonable time frame.
So while we're talking about formal and informal requirements of NATO membership, what would happen if the US just pulled out of NATO, whether by invoking the treaty or perhaps by just saying we're not going to keep up our Article 5 commitment?
Well, it would be a calamity, frankly, because as somebody who was at NATO for 38 years, it does depend on what America does and doesn't do. I've lived, Stuart, through so many NATO crises. When the Americans came in, everything worked all of a sudden. They provided, I remember Kosovo in 1999 when I was the NATO spokesman, they provided all of the aircraft that could fly at night, all of the targeting information, all of the precision strike weapons, the search and rescue operation. You suddenly realize that American infrastructure, that system of commands, intelligence, that system of bases and training grounds in Europe is really, if you like, the backbone, the skeleton that makes NATO function. And of course, the United States has the Supreme Allied Command of Europe at the moment, and therefore the responsibility not just for planning what its own forces do, but for also planning for what the European forces do, who are all trained to fight under an American command, albeit a NATO command, in wartime. They provide the nuclear deterrence, although the UK and to some extent France have useful additional roles there. So it's very difficult for me, quite frankly, to imagine a United States without NATO. I could imagine a NATO maybe without one particular country or another particular country. It would be a blow to prestige, but NATO will survive. But the United States and NATO are more or less the same thing. Frankly, once you sort of look at, as I said, at the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day military planning and preparations, and I think as far as Putin or China or any other adversary is concerned, a NATO without the United States would lose most of its credibility and would be a NATO that would be challengeable and therefore challenged. Whether the French would be successful at coming forward with the argument they've made for years that this is the time for the hour of Europe and for Europe to stand on its own feet and integrate its forces. Remember, we had the idea of a European army back in the 1950s, although it never quite happened. We will see, and I think the Europeans will certainly make an effort, but it's basically the confidence in the United States that pulls NATO together, and I doubt that the Europeans would have sufficient confidence in each other to try to create a sort of European-only NATO. So God forbid that it would happen, and let's pray that it doesn't.